Civil society group Black Sash is raising concerns over the postponement of yesterday's budget speech. The tabling of the speech by the first budget from the National Coalition government was adjourned yesterday to allow the parties to speak some more. Been reported that there were disagreements over a proposed increase of 2 percentage points in VAT. The amended budget is now due to be tabled on the 12th of March. Black Sash's Thandi Henkemann says the postponement is not a good sign and could affect some of the most vulnerable in our society.
I think as Black Sash, it's safe to say that we are both shocked and deeply concerned. This is unprecedented. We have not had a postponement of the budget speech, at least in the last 30 years. And also, this is the first budget for GNU. And the fact that it was postponed and delayed is not a good sign. The implications and knock-on effect on the most vulnerable is still to be seen.
Henkemann says they're also opposed to a big increase in value-added tax.
I think, primarily in our first point that I'd like to discuss is just what has been proposed and put on the table, particularly the VAT increase. As Black Sash, we are opposed to that because it'll impact majority of people residing in South Africa who are already struggling to make ends meet. So we are looking at a budget that will create more opportunity for our more vulnerable, which will allow more independence and autonomy for our more vulnerable, and allow people to become more active as citizens in this country.
Well, joining us now, the Programme Coordinator of the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Group, Mervyn Abrahams. Mervyn, good afternoon to you, and thanks so much for talking to us. I can understand, and I realise this may be a minority view, but I can understand why the National Treasury wanted such a big VAT increase. VAT's a very difficult tax to avoid. Everyone has to pay it. It would share the problems equally, would go the argument, and it's much easier for them to actually do it. But there are also arguments against it. What impact would a 2 percentage point VAT increase have on particularly the poorer people in our society?
So good afternoon, Stephen, and good afternoon to all your viewers. And I fully agree. Value-added tax is an easy tax to implement. It's easy to recoup the money, and it's spread around, and you probably could fill the deficit based on the value-added tax. However, we need to look at the scope of the value-added tax and its implications for households, as you mentioned. Currently, in the basket of food that we are tracking, 22 foods carries VAT on it. And in the month of January, that VAT came to 331 Rand. Now, adding another 2%, will add another 44 Rand and would take the VAT on that 22 foods to 375 Rand and 16 cents, which is way above what ordinary working class and poor people can pay with regard to VAT. Now, another issue, Stephen, is the scope of a VAT increase. I mean, it touches every single good and services that is being sold in South Africa. And whilst we agree and welcome the fact that the minister has indicated around expanding the zero-rated basket, we really welcome that. However, you cannot fully protect the poor from that increase because poor people will also have to buy electricity, which will not be in that basket. They also have to buy shoes, toiletries, and rents, etc., etc. So the poor will disproportionately, percentage-wise in terms of their income, carry the deficit for the country. And therein, we believe it to be unjust and unfair.
There's going to be all sorts of political negotiation now, and unfortunately, you and I are not in that room, Mervyn. It will, I presume, be mainly between the ANC and the DA, but obviously there are other parties in the coalition. And at some point, someone is going to say, all right, Democratic Alliance, you oppose, you refuse, you reject a 2 percentage point VAT increase. We do need the money. Let's do a 1 percentage point VAT increase. I presume that would still have a huge impact on millions of people.
Yes, it will have a major impact, but I think what government really needs to do now is to put all the suggestions into the public space. So the DA, for instance, is saying that they have presented measures to cut back on expenditure. very good and well what would that expenditure entails. The country cannot afford to cut back on teachers, on nurses, on doctors, on municipal electricity workers, etc. We require them. I mean, the country can cut back on the number of politicians, for instance. It would actually not have any impact in terms of the long-term viability of our economy. So we need to know what that is so that we can compare. Currently, we know the impact of a VAT increase, but we do not know the other suggestions. And so it's very difficult for us in civil society to do a comparative analysis in terms of what the long-term impact could be and what the lesser of the two evils could be.
The other thing is that, okay, if you're going to say we need to cut back on spending, whatever decision you make about cutting back on spending is going to lead to a huge political fight. I'm no expert, but I'll put money on the fact that the parties in the coalition would not agree on any cutbacks between them by the time the deadline expires, which is 12th of March. I mean, there's just no way they'll find anything they agree on.
Yes, and then that is definitely a worry and an area of concern. But I think they have to be grown up, and we find ourselves in a predicament. On the one hand, we know that we have a deficit and we have to cover that deficit. That is clear. The question really is what would be the best mechanism? We would argue that a 2% VAT is not the best mechanism. What are the others saying? And let us begin to look at that. We would be saying, let's take SARS at their word and let's say, look, there are much loopholes in terms of tax collection. If tax collection if those loopholes can be closed, then there would be sufficient revenue for the state. That is one area. There would be other areas around potential expenditure cutbacks. Other areas could involve talking around a wealth tax increase, having a proper public debate around it. And I would also not leave off the table the possibility of a 1 or 2% increase in corporate income tax, because we have cut corporate income tax about a decade ago on the assumption that it would lead to greater investment in businesses and potentially greater employment. And we have not seen that happening. So let's bring all this into the public domain, let's discuss it, and let's find a way in which we can bridge this deficit. But a 2% VAT increase on the poor would mean the poor would have to disproportionately pay for this budget deficit. And therein lies, in our view, an area which is absolutely unfair.
The real problem, Mervyn, and you would know this far better than I would, is that the real problem is that our economy is not growing. We're not creating sustainable livelihoods, sustainable incomes for the millions of people who don't have work. And what we're going to do now as a society is have another shouting match, which we're quite good at, I suppose, about VAT. We should be arguing and we should be working on trying to create those jobs. And I haven't seen any politician mention that, insofar as I know, since yesterday.
Stephen, you're absolutely correct, and we would fully agree that VAT and the debate around VAT is one part of a much bigger debate. And the much bigger debate is how do we get our economy to grow in a sustainable manner going forward to create the jobs that we require. And in many respects, some of us would argue that that would involve some pain, that some of us would have to carry for the long-term good. And so we are piecemeal discussing this strategy versus that strategy, whilst the issue is how do we grow our economy, how do we ensure that it actually happens, how do we create more jobs, and how do we eradicate in the long term this intergenerational poverty traps that keeps half of our population in absolute poverty.
Mervyn, thank you very much indeed. Mervyn Abrahams is the Programme Coordinator at the Pietermaritzburg Economic Justice and Dignity Project. Won't be the last time you hear and see a conversation around what happened with our budget.